Alrighty, hello and welcome to the stream. Parson reads the book of Luke, and I swear I did not plan this, but today we are going to finish off the book of Luke, reading chapters 23 and 24, which aptly appropriate. Today is Good Friday, and we are going to read the death and resurrection story of Jesus, at least according to the book of Luke. And so that's the basic plan today. Of course, we'll still do our typical study elements and talk about story and narrative purposes of the resurrection and all that. So today's going to be a bit of a longer read because we do have two pretty long chapters to cover. So we're just going to dive right into it. I'm just going to start us off with a quick word of prayer, and then we will begin. If you want to follow along, I will be using the New International Version, or NIV. So let's just bow our heads quickly. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for, this weekend that we have to be reminded of your gift to us, the gift of salvation, the gift of life. And I just pray that as we read your word today, we would be not just reminded, but inspired to pursue a life of sacrifice and giving. And I just pray that we would be drawn closer to you, and as we remember how you have been generous to us. I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so chapter 23. We're just going to jump right into it. I'm going to read actually a couple verses in chapter 22 first. I think just kind of builds up to the start of chapter 23. As I did mention last week, chapter 22 kind of ends abruptly. So I'm actually going to go backwards and read that part as we begin the passion story of, the death of Jesus Christ. So this is actually chapter 22. I'm going to start with chapter 22, verse 66, and just read through that as well as chapter 23. Like, I'll treat it all as if it's all one entry. As I don't know why the Bible translators even bothered to split this part. They should have just moved the beginning of chapter 23 a little bit earlier, but whatever. So it's chapter 22, verse 66. At the daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together. And Jesus was led before them. "If you are the Messiah," they said, "tell us." Jesus answered, "If I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." And they all asked, "Are you the Son of God then?" Jesus replied, "Well, you say that I am." Then they said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips." Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar, and claims to be Messiah, a king." So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." But they insisted, "He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here." On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at the time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased, because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. For what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. And that day Herod and Pilate became friends, because before this they had been enemies. Now Pilate called together the chief priests and rulers of the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence, and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. So as you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore I will punish him and then release him." But the whole crowd shouted, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us, not Barnabas. Release Barabbas to us." Now Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Now wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again. But the people kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Now for the third time Pilate spoke to them. "Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found him on no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will have him punished and then release him." But with loud shouts they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. Verse 26, as the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon of Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Now Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, 'Blessed are the children of women, the wombs that have never bore, and the breasts that have never nursed.' Then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall upon us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Now 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with Jesus to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, it's a badass name, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on Jesus' right and the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. Now the people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. And they said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." I'm just going to change the lighting a bit. I'm noticing that there's quite a bit of a glow. Actually, I have a simpler way of doing this. Give me a sec here. I totally forgot to change my screen a bit. So the glare was from the screen, not from my lighting here. Sorry, anyway. I'm gonna reread that part because I interrupted myself. Verse 36. And the soldiers also came up and mocked him, and they offered him wine vinegar, and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." Now there was a written notice above Jesus, which read, "King of the Jews." Now one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him Well, aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and save us. But the other criminal rebuked him, saying, Don't you fear God, since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said to Jesus, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus answered him, Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Verse 44. It was now about noon, and darkness had come over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. For the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. And Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. When Jesus said this, he breathed his last. The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, Surely this was a righteous man. When all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. But all who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things. Now there was a man named Joseph, a member of the council, a good and upright man, who had not consented to their decision and action. He came from the Judean town of Arimathea, and he himself was waiting for the kingdom of God. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body. Then he took it down, wrapped it in linen cloth, and placed it in a tomb cut in the rock, one of which no one had been laid. It was preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes. But they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. Alright, so that's chapter 23. There was quite a lot there, so we're gonna go through this kind of slowly. Because, of course, one of the things that's just problematic about reading a text, and I mean, there's been many a Jesus movie that tries to spell out exactly how this crucifixion would have went down. The book of Luke, if we were strict about just reading through the text alone, which you guys know I haven't been doing that. I've been pretty liberal about bouncing around between texts and other like biblical texts as well as other records. You would know that Jesus's crucifixion was a very long and arduous process, but the book of Luke doesn't really care to tell us much about it. All the book of Luke was concerned about was kind of people that were around, and the reason for this is how historical documents generally behave. And the idea is, naming these people, there were, I guess you could say, like, how do I put this? Okay, so I'm gonna turn this around a little bit. And you know how there are many, you can't really call them skeptics, because it's not a skeptical thing to think this. To be a skeptic just means you just doubt anything told to you at face value. But people who are Bible doubters, and they would try and give you the argument that, like, oh, the Bible's kind of made up. But how the New Testament obviously doesn't, like, there's a lot of problems when you read the New Testament with that claim. And the New Testament, when it uses, like, these random-ass people that are kind of there, like, for example, this Simon of Cyrene guy. Like, what's the deal with this guy? And, of course, talking about Pilate and Herod and their relationship and stuff like that. The reason why the book of Luke brings this up is because from a historical document perspective, you could understand that these things happened. They did happen because the other elements are all there. And so even though there's some legendary aspects of Jesus' life, that, there's a lot of question behind it, and understandable. Some stuff behind, some parts of the Jesus story is legendary, but the elements such as like, Herod and Pilate becoming friends and their former animosity toward each other. Of course, the book of Luke assumes certain things that the original audiences, aka people in the book of Acts, would have already have known, and I'm going to fill in some of those gaps for you. So that's kind of what we're going to do as we process chapter 23. And yes, I will talk about some of the kind of obvious things that, like, once again, if you watch many a Jesus movie, you would have run into these things about the crucifixion. And I'll just kind of, because they're kind of common knowledge at this point, because once again, we do have historical documents, whether we're talking about Josephus or we're talking about, what's that guy? I'm trying to remember. He was a Roman, I'm thinking of the Roman guy before Virgil. So Virgil was a guy who wrote about stuff that happened well after the destruction of the temple. His his predecessor writes a bit about Jesus. I can't remember his name though. I'd have to look it up. But Virgil does make some reference to it as well. But Virgil's a lot later, so I know if I refer to Virgil, I would say Virgil's a reliable source. But I know there's going to be those, like, real anal people that would say, like, well, Virgil's like writing like what, 110 AD, so he's well later and would not, 110 AD is like 80 years after Jesus, so how reliable could that be? But I mean, to be fair, um, I've talked about this in the beginning of our Luke study. Jesus is the litmus test of how you analyze historical figures, because you think of anyone, like a lot of historical figures before Jesus, any records about them are written well later than they are. So a good example would be Siddhartha Gautama. If you don't know who that is, like, is a case in point, because most of his records, we don't have anything directly about Siddhartha Gautama. The closest thing we have is stuff that was written like 200 BC, but Siddhartha was well before that. He was well before that. Siddhartha Gautama probably, well, the reason why, once again, and this is where you run into some historical problems when you analyze other religions. If given away the big hint of who Siddhartha is, people document the birth of Buddhism with his historical writings, which are hundreds of years after Siddhartha himself lived, and so if we can be pretty lenient with the Buddha and his writings, and any document, or actually he himself didn't actually write anything. All the writings about once again, because all the earliest records of the Buddha are hundreds of years after the Buddha himself lived. in a similar fashion, you can say that, like, Alexander the Great is another example of this. Like, any historical document about him that we actually have are all dated hundreds of years well after he died. But Jesus, the thing that makes him interesting is that all the writings, historical writings, and I know some people get a little skeptical because half of them are like Jews. So, well, most of the writings about Jesus were Jews at the beginning, because I mean that's how Christianity started. It started as a Jewish cult, and so some people may say, well, these people were writing immediately after to try and give themselves legitimacy to their legends or whatever. But once again, you can literally say that about anything. But going back to the book of Luke here, and the purpose of, as we read through Luke 23 and 24, and why there's going to be gaps in the crucifixion as well as the resurrection story, and there's going to be certain gaps in it. The reason why I'm talking about this is because I will cover it for you. Like, I'll talk about some of these gaps and fill in the gaps for you. Luke himself assumes that his audience already knows this, and this is where, once again, you run into this problem when you have to deal with any kind of religious text, because Christianity is not the only people that do this. All various religions do this. They all do this. They all write with certain assumptions that the original audiences would have already known, because in context, when you read through the book of Luke, we have to remember that the book of Luke was written like late 60s AD. And so that's like, I don't know, well, at least 30 years, 30 years after Jesus' death. The Christian church has been around for like 25 or so years. And so, the church is that young. And once again, a lot of these guys would have had pretty recent memory of like the teachings of Jesus. They would have known the disciples for sure, because most of them were still around. James being the only one that was martyred at the time, and Judas committing suicide. But then Matthias replaces Judas as we get to the book of Acts. But basically, most of these guys were still around. So the Christian church had the, first-hand sources of the faith. The first pope is still around. All the earliest archbishops they're all around. And so a lot of the oral tradition would have easily been maintained. Whereas, as time passes, and of course, I've talked about this when if you talk about like, if you study the book of Matthew, for instance, especially the book of Matthew and the book of John, the way they're written is very different, because the way that they're written is to keep a tradition well after all the earliest members of Christianity would have died off. Whereas the book of Luke is a little bit different. The book of Luke assumes most of these guys are still around. And so because of this, the book of Luke doesn't need to spell out stuff for you. And I mentioned this when it comes to like, the Lord's Prayer, the Sermon on the Mount. Certain things were omitted in the book of Luke because most of Luke's audience would have been very familiar with a lot of the content that, like, for example, you find in the book of Matthew. They would have already known that. And so there was no need for Luke to spell it out all over again. Because once again, the way church was back in the ancient days, church was more like an extra thing that like the early believers did on top of, their regular Jewish Sabbath and all that stuff. And really how church was treated was them just hanging out talking about Jesus over like drink. Excuse me. It was like basically the idea of church back then was them talking about Jesus while having beer with each other. That was basically what church was. And talk about how awesome Jesus was and the stuff that he did, and how life was better, and how they could, live in being forgiven by God, and talk about how awesome the resurrection is. And so Luke's documents assumed that was a normal tradition, this idea of like church is the Christians hanging out, having a beer, and talking about Jesus. And so a lot of the details are omitted in Luke. And I bring this up again when we're talking about the death of Jesus, because once again, I know some people might be like, well, isn't there a lot more to what happened when Jesus died? Which there is. And the book of Matthew and the book of John. The book of Matthew is probably a better one to study when you want to look at what happened. The book of Matthew does fill in a lot of those gaps. As a matter of fact, I actually did read the Matthew account last year in regards to Good Friday. And you can, if you watch that stream, you know that I go into a lot of detail about it. Because the book of Matthew obviously goes into a lot of detail. The book of Luke doesn't, because, once again, the assumption is that the original audiences already know. So they already, for instance, going back to the text now, they would have known how the execution process would have gone down. People would have known this. And one reason why people would have known pretty well, like even the Jewish people would have known how Roman executions were carried out. Because, and I know I'm going to have to jump a little bit here, because this will come up again when we talk about like false messiahs in the book of Acts. So this topic will come back again. But basically there were a bunch of other guys claiming to be the Messiah, and they were all executed as well. and most of them probably in the same way. And so, because of this, the Jewish people would have become familiar with crucifixion. I know that sounds really messed up when you say it out loud like that, but a lot of the Jews would have become pretty familiar with how crucifixion goes down, which is really messed up. But that's how it was. That's how it was, and that, it became an occurrence because of all these like other messiahs that were showing up and claiming to be, the Son of God and everything, and all of them would also be executed via crucifixion. And I think that's a pretty good reason why the book of Luke omits it from its writings about talking about the crucifixion itself, because why would you feel the need to tell a bunch of Jews something they already know? That's like an insult. That's like a massive insult to people's intelligence. And so, and if you wanted to play the race card, it would make Luke look super racist if he had to like try to he basically be like Roman-splaining. I don't know. I'm making up a word here, but he would basically be Roman-splaining to Jews stuff that they would already know. So Luke is not an idiot like that. He knows not to insult people's intelligence, and so he writes with that in mind. An interesting thing that I just wanted to bring up was this initial kind of exchange between Pilate and Herod. And once again, the book of Luke brings this up because we actually do have historical documents about Herod and Pilate's animosity. They actually didn't like each other very much. Now, before Josephus refers to a guy named, oh shit, what's this guy's name? His name was like, it was something of Arbelos. I can't remember the guy's first name. He was like he probably had a normal first name. It's like Simon of Arbelos or something. It's probably a Simon. It's always a Simon. So a guy named Simon of Arbelos was a historian during, like, we could say during Jesus' time, probably a little bit after. So a way to safely assume it, and I'll probably bring him up again in the book of Acts, because he would be relevant, because he was probably an historian during the book of Acts time. So like, let's say like 40 to 50 something AD. And Josephus obviously refers to this guy quite a bit. And Arbeus basically talks about how he does actually bring to light that there used to be an animosity between Pilate and Herod, and the reason is probably pretty obvious. Racism. Let's be real. It's a real problem, and it was obviously a problem between, like, when you have a bunch of Roman, Roman occupiers in Judea. Jews don't like that, including the Jewish stand-in for like a political leader. And so I mentioned this before when I talked about Herod in earlier streams, but basically Herod's purpose, if you will, is to give, like, he's the token character, in the sense of, like, I know it sounds so terrible when you have to talk about it like this, but in the world today, when people talk about, like, oh, like, Kamala Harris was, making history because she's the first woman of color in a position like her, as like vice president of the United States. And so the fact that she was a woman of color was like a big deal, because that's a real representation of America, kind of thing. Herod kind of serves the same purpose. I know it sounds super terrible when I'm basically making that equivalency, but you get the idea. So even though the Romans were in charge, to kind of give the Jews like some kind of sense of, like, okay, we're not just occupied by Romans, even though they are. They had a political leader that was, well, the same ethnicity and from the same tradition, and that would be Herod. But just because you put your token you know, person of color there, that doesn't mean things are good between the Romans and the Jews, obviously not. And so Herod was a manifestation of the people's hatred towards Rome. And so, of course, like Herod himself would kind of be like, yeah, F the Romans kind of thing. And so Pilate, being the Roman governor who has to oversee Judea, yeah, there would obviously be like hatred between them because Herod would be like, you know, F the Romans and down with the Romans and all that. But at the same time, he also had to be, you know, a representative for the Romans so that the Jews don't get mad at Rome. And so it's kind of like, duh. And so I mean that's why, you know, Herod is, you know, even though he's not a great guy, you can feel a little bit of sympathy for the guy because he's like just kind of shoved into his position to like appease, you know, the people's sense of security, even though like once again society back then was clearly not stable at all. But Herod was kind of like a figurehead. And so, you know, anyone in this position naturally comes to be quite resentful, and Herod is no exception to the rule. I mean, that's why he goes around banging his like sister-in-law. So there's that. But Herod, yeah. So Herod and Pilate obviously had animosity, and of course Pilate having to deal with all the like hatred toward him, you know, being the Roman occupier. You know, he naturally would become very like embittered, and that shows in a lot of Pilate's character in the story that he's this very embittered person, and he's to put it bluntly, he was just like, you know, he's had it to the back teeth of like the Jews bullshit. That's, I mean, that's the nice way of putting it. He had, you know, he really don't want to deal with these people, and it's one of those things that like, you know, some pastors and Bible scholars talk about how Pilate, you know, you read through the story, especially in the Matthew account, Pilate kind of like he has no backbone, right? He just kind of, he's supposed to be like he's supposed to be the guy in charge. He's the Roman governor, and yet like he gets, he basically like succumbs to like the Jewish rioters that were present. So basically, what happens, and once again, the Book of Luke implies this, but if you read the Book of Matthew account, it'll tell you in more detail that the chief priests that wanted Jesus dead, they what's that word? They kind of invoked and provoked the people to like, you know, rile them up so that they would want Jesus dead. And they, what they did was they would rile the people up, and the people would threaten to riot if they didn't get what they wanted. And that's where, like, you know, you read through parts of the story and it's kind of like, well, that's, some parts are really stupid in the story, and, you know, understandable, it is really stupid. But the reason why what happens in the Book of Luke is so stupid is because it shows how much, or how lacking, I guess you could say, how lacking of a backbone Pilate actually has. And so the part I'm talking about is where basically the people demand that like a terrorist basically is released from prison and have Jesus take the death penalty in place of a terrorist. That's like asking, like, I don't know. I'm trying to think of like who's a well, it's, me being the cynical person is like, who's a nice person that like we actually like around here. But it's kind of like asking for like, okay, so this is gonna be a terrible joke. Remember when like, you know, Osama bin Laden got captured before, you know, Obama capped his ass? But imagine if like the people said, actually, we don't want Osama bin Laden dead. Let's take like, I don't know, say like Betty White, and have Betty White die instead of like Osama bin Laden. Let's trade them. That's basically what the people were doing. Which, you know, when you put it like that, it is really ridiculous what these people were doing. But, you know, the chief priests really wanted Jesus dead, that they were willing to do something that insane. And, you know, to a modern rational reader, we would think, well, this is ridiculous. Why would they exchange a terrorist for Jesus? But it really just showed like how spineless Pilate is, and once again, even though you can be pretty quick to judge Pilate and his like his cowardly behavior, but at the same time you have to be a little bit like sympathetic to the guy, because I mean if you had his job, you would quickly find out how much you hated the job, and you would just do whatever it took to get yourself out of trouble at any given time, and that's basically what Pilate does. And of course, in the Matthew account, there's a famous scene where he basically takes like a basin of water and he washes his hands, and says, "I will be clean of this crime that you are committing," because of course in the Matthew account, it makes him not as spineless, and in the Matthew account, when Pilate washes his hands, it makes him look less spineless and really puts it on the people of how stupid they're actually behaving. The book of Luke just kind of just goes beat by event. So like, okay, this happened, that happened, and then Jesus is now going to be brought to execution. And then of course, the details of that basically the book of Luke skips over like the torturing that Jesus would have endured. And it's one of those weird things too, where like, how the hell do so many people actually make it to the crucifixion process? Because we read in the story that like Jesus and two other guys are like put on crucifixes, but if you actually read like, for example, Josephus or Virgil, and you read how crucifixions actually went down, you have to wonder like, how the hell did anyone survive this shit? Because like, okay, maybe I speak for just me, and unless you're like the jackest of jack dudes, like, I'm gonna make the assumption that most of you, just like myself, we would not survive the process of a crucifixion. So strap yourselves in, because I'm gonna tell the story again, because it's Good Friday. We're gonna talk about it. I mean, it's like the time of year you can talk about it like brazenly. So basically, first you go through the whipping. Now the whipping, I'm not just talking about some kind of BDSM kink. This is like real ass torture of like, first of all, it's not like a single headed whip like in your BDSM fantasies, you freaks. But like, this is what they call the famous cat of nine tails, and basically what the cat of nine tails was, it was a whip with 9 heads, which is ironic that's called the cat of 9 tails, because whips are, the ends of a whip is called a head. So it's kind of ironic that they would call it that. But whatever. The cat of 9 tails was a whip with 9 heads, and usually there would be like little like hooks on them, and the hooks are designed to like cause flaying. So for those of you who don't know what that is, flaying is when you hit something and it's designed to tear flesh off. That's what flaying is. When it like, and that's why like, you think of like in like those crazy medieval movies or stuff like that. That's why like, you look at some of these guys like battle armor and you think like it's so ridiculous, where like guys have like little claw bits on their gauntlets and whatever, and maces have like little hooks on them. It's all designed for what is called flaying, and flaying is designed to rend flesh with a traditionally blunter object. And so maces is a good example of this. And then of course like battle gauntlets having gloves, right? Your fist is normally not something that causes bleeding. It doesn't, your fist doesn't normally tear through flesh, but you think of like gangster movies and guys like they wear their like brass knuckle things. That's the point of the brass knuckle, is to cause flame when you hit somebody. Well, basically, now imagine that with like, a 9-headed whip. So, a given whip, that's like at least 8 out of 9 will hit for sure. And so that's like, well, that's that's at least 8 or even all 9 hooks, lashing onto you a little bit and then pulling, which let's be real, that shit's gonna hurt a lot actually. Now imagine that you don't just get hit by this thing like once, but traditionally you get hit like 30 to 40 times. the 40 times thing is actually, we actually use this in not really modern colloquialism now, but when we talk about the 40 lashes, so some people will use the saying, the 40 lashings. And basically what they mean by that is like, oh shit, this thing's gonna hurt. I'm getting 40 lashings. It means like, okay, this is gonna hurt like shit. That's what that means. And so that old statement comes from the Roman execution process, or this part of it, this torture process of the 40 hits from, 40 times 9. So like, that's what, 360 hits? Like, damn, that's a lot of hits. And remember, all these hits have this little hook thing that's pulling skin every time. And so like, you think of it like that. Like, if you got this little hook pulling on shit every time it hits you, well, there's a chance it could latch on bone, which, I mean, there's a good chance I could just tear your body apart. 2, like, it could catch onto organs and stuff after it's ripped off the outer layer of your flesh. And I know I'm going to like graphic territory now, but like, that part, like, you think about like taking 360 hits from a whip with little hooks on it, like, it's a miracle people survive this shit. So I mean, and once again, it just shows like, when we talk about like Jesus died for us and going through this process, like, no, this was like some serious like pain and suffering. And I know I'm making some of you guys queasy talking about like, a little thing that's like ripping your flesh as you get hit by it. But that's only the beginning. That's only the beginning. So after they've whipped you, a whole ass bunch of times, then the Romans, because they're sadistic, little shits, because all Romans know is how to be violent and make people bleed, the Roman guards tend to play a game. And depending on how many there are, but since Jesus was like, there was a lot of notoriety built around him, probably would have been a fair number of Roman guards to do this. They would play a little game, and they would basically say, all right, we're all gonna take shots at this guy, and if the guy dies during this part, winner, like, everybody buys the winner a drink. So and remember, these are Roman guards, so like, these aren't like, these aren't little love taps that Jesus has to take from these guys. These are full on like MMA fighter like swings that Jesus has to take from like various Roman guards. So that only adds to like the amount of pain, and it's once again, it's a miracle that you're not dead from that, because like, yeah, us average people, if let's say you took a hit from like, and this is without you like not defending yourself, because remember, you're a prisoner and you got your chains and everything, so you can't defend yourself. And good luck trying to brace yourself for like, imagine if you had like 10 MMA guys all take a shot at you, like their best shot, not some kind of weenie dog, like hit, right? Like a real ass like MMA guy, just bam, right in the square in the face, or like, right, one guy might be a little cheeky and kick Jesus right in the dick or something, because there's at least one of those guys. So you got like a bunch of these guards just like hitting him, and it's a miracle you survived that. So Jesus somehow survives that. And then, because the Romans were sadistic and loved watching people suffer, Jesus had to carry his own cross to this location that we'll talk about later. But imagine like, okay, so you just received the hugest ass whooping of your life that you somehow survived. And then they expect you to carry, like, I don't know, how heavy would a cross be? Like, at least 200 pounds? Because remember, it has to be able to support a human body on it. So, let's say like a 200-pound, 2 large logs of wood. And now Jesus has to drag this thing around. And, you got your famous, church art of, the suffering Jesus holding the cross. And, imagine you have to drag that thing around. And you have to drag it pretty far. Because, as the Bible points out, he goes to a place called the Rock of the Skull, or the place called the Skull. And archaeologists wonder where this place actually is. But what we would have known about it is that it would have been a little hill area outside of the city. And that makes sense because obviously you don't want dead bodies inside the city. Kind of nasty. So executions tend to happen outside, which means that from where Pilate had Jesus in prison, which would be somewhere in the city, Jesus had to take this cross and take it outside the city. Now, I know Jerusalem is not the biggest city. Even modern Jerusalem is pretty small. But the prospect of carrying a 200-pound object from like inside the city to outside of it, like even a small place like Jerusalem, like let's just pretend that like you started from like 5 miles in Jerusalem. So imagine you had to carry a 200 block of wood for 5 miles from the city of Jerusalem to outside of it. Now imagine doing that while you're bleeding and shit because you just received the biggest ass whooping of your life. So imagine you had to do all that. Like it was a terrible process. It was absolutely horrible. And so Jesus had to do this. And the Bible brings up that Jesus had sorry. The Bible points out that Jesus needed help to do this because he was in such crappy conditions after the beating he received. And you know, it's interesting that the Bible doesn't bring up that the other, well, because the other guys aren't that important. But no doubt that like the other people who would have died would have needed help carrying their own crosses. Because it's a miracle you didn't just pass on and die from that because you know you're bleeding to death. You probably haven't eaten in a while. So your energy's like at an all-time low. And then you have to like carry your own cross, and that's insane. And so the Bible points out that Jesus gets help from a guy named Simon of Cyrene. And it's interesting that the Bible actually points this guy out. And it ironically debunks a text that came out hundreds of years later to try and say Jesus didn't die. And the reason for this is that if Simon is of Cyrene, that means he's from somewhere in North Africa, which means he would have been a lot darker. Like he would have had a much darker skin tone. Now, we could assume that Simon of Cyrene is Jewish himself, but he probably would have still had quite the tan because he doesn't live in Jerusalem. Now, something I didn't point out earlier, but once again, you know, you read the earlier chapters and then you just remember that this is during the Passover, so it makes sense that there would have been a lot more people in Jerusalem. And this, once again, going back to the Romans punching Jesus like MMA fighters, would have been a lot worse in Jesus' case because there would have been a lot more Roman guards around because they would have needed increased security during a festival because there would have been a lot more Jews around because Passover kind of had, you know, the rules of Passover is that you're supposed to go to the temple and do sacrifices. And of course, by the first century, there is some leniency. It's not like everybody does the sacrifice on the exact same day because that would not be humanly possible. You know how long that would take? It would take you days. So the Passover process would probably last for like a week or something like that. But anyway, basically during this week, you would have a whole bunch of people. And if you know, you had your more devoted Jews, they would have come from wherever they were from. And Simon of Cyrene would have been one of these Jews because he comes from somewhere in North Africa and travels all the way to Jerusalem to do sacrifices. But of course, the Bible does point out that he is a foreigner. He's technically a foreigner. So he's Jewish by race, but not by nationality, I guess you could say. You know, like I'm Chinese by race, but I'm Canadian. So kind of like that. And so Simon of Cyrene shows up and he has to help, and he helps Jesus to carry the cross. And this actually debunks a popular myth about how Jesus didn't die. And the myth goes that apparently Jesus was spared the cross because they switched Simon of Cyrene with Jesus, which actually, if you actually think about that, that actually sounds super racist and ridiculous. Because, you know, as I've just talked about, Jesus had just received the biggest ass whooping of his life. And are you going to tell me that a black guy could be swapped out for a beaten Jew? That is not a hill you want to die on. So that is probably not a good myth to follow. So, but there's a lot of people who actually believe that myth. But anyway, crazy sidetrack there. But it's always fun to point that part of the story out, because by bringing up Simon of Cyrene of all people, it's like it's pretty hard to suggest the idea that Jesus didn't die, because there's no way you could have swapped out Jesus with a black guy like that. That was that if you're gonna actually accentuate that, that makes you look very racist. I'm just saying. So I think the Book of Luke, it's one of those things that, like, by the miracle of God or something, that like somehow the Book of Luke covered its own tracks by by not running into like problems of when people try to debunk that Jesus died. But it's like, no, the Book of Luke already has that covered. There's no way Jesus would have been swapped out, because the guy that people think he could have been swapped out with, it would never work. And if you're going to suggest that it does, that is not a hill you want to die on. So, Simon of Cyrene, that's the significance of bringing him up, actually. And that the Book of Luke does bring him up, that he's actually named here. And of course, the other thing, too, is that it's safe to assume that Simon of Cyrene would have been around later in the Book of Acts, because, of course, we have the day of Pentecost and everything, and a bunch of Jews from other places all go to Jerusalem, and Simon of Cyrene could have possibly been there. Because another thing, too, is that there would be no reason to bring up people by name, unless the suggestion was that the Christian, like an early Christian, could have asked that person. They could have asked us. Like, the idea suggested here is that by Luke bringing up Simon of Cyrene, people could have actually gone up to Simon and asked him, yo, did this really happen? Did you really carry Jesus' cross for him for a little bit? And Simon could have been like, yeah, totally. That was a thing. Anyway, continuing on the crazy execution process. So after Jesus had to drag his wounded behind several miles, carrying a 200+ pound cross while bleeding to death, they then would have had to, rip off the clothes that he was wearing. So not only do you have to take the biggest ass whooping of your life, you go through the biggest embarrassment. And this is why, like, death on a cross was just so, like, why everybody absolutely hated it. It was, like, the worst thing, because not only was it, like, insanely painful, which it was also extremely humiliating. Like, no one wants their last moments in life to be, like, hanging on a tree butt naked. Nobody wants that. Like, nobody would want that. But that's exactly what happened to Jesus. And so they would have ripped off his clothes. And there's this part here that the Bible once again glosses over, but it does play on, like, for example, the book of Isaiah and the famous suffering servant passage in Isaiah 53 and 54. And there's this part where the Roman guards gamble for Jesus' clothes. And they basically play like, oh yeah, we're gonna take this guy's clothes as like a trophy or something messed up. I don't, why you would want a guy's like bloody ass, linen cloth that he's been wearing, and it's all bloodied and stuff. So who knows what diseases are lying in a bloody outfit like that, or what diseases you could contract from walking around with someone's blood-stained outfit. But basically, these Roman guards, they would have, like, they're bored out of their minds if they had to execute these guys. They got to keep themselves entertained somehow. So they gamble for it. And that's humiliating, right? Like, your last moments is hanging butt naked on a tree while people gamble for your, like, worn out, bloody clothes. Like, that's just so embarrassing and so humiliating. Then, of course, the worst, the part that everybody remembers, and when you watch those, like, Jesus movies and they get, like, pretty graphic about it, and then, like, what they do is they take these, like, they put the guy on the wooden planks, the cross, and they take these, like, huge ass nails, and the nails would have been like 9 inches to a foot, and they would drive these things through your, like, wrist and your feet. And the reason is so that when they mount you on the cross, you stay there. And so they drill these like huge ass nails, and here's the other thing too. There's no way you would survive this, because even if you somehow survive the suffocation process, which we'll cover soon enough. But like, these nails have been used like multiple times, as I mentioned well before Jesus, and even well after Jesus. There were other like quote unquote messiahs that would have gone through the crucifixion process as well. So all these guys, these nails get used multiple times, and this isn't the 21st century. This is the first century. So they don't have ways of sanitizing these nails, and not like the Romans would have given a shit anyway to sanitize these things. So, assuming you don't get like AIDS from these things and other blood diseases. So even if you somehow survive the suffocation process, which is what's going to happen next, you would die from HIV/AIDS not long after, because once again, medication for this stuff didn't exist back then. So if you had a nail used on like a bunch of other dudes, and you're essentially sharing blood with these guys, you're gonna die of AIDS. So once again, this crucifixion process, it was a way to ensure you died. Like, if death by crucifixion, there was a 0% chance of surviving. Which I know some people have proposed the idea that Jesus somehow survived it, but like, no, it's a miracle he even made it as far as he did. It's a miracle anyone makes it as far as they do. Because if you actually read Virgil, 90% of people who go through the crucifixion process don't actually die on a cross. Most of them die well before then, because the safest assumption is that most people would have died at the second phase, the Roman guards practicing their MMA moves on you. Most people actually die in that process. So it's actually surprising to find that like a lot of people survive the whipping part, but they're probably too exhausted at that point to survive phase 2. Let alone surviving phase 3, and now we're going to phase 4 of the crucifixion process. And phase 4 is after you get these, HIV riddled nails driven through your wrists and your feet, or ankles more accurately, I guess you could say. Because once again, it doesn't make sense when people say like goes through the hand, because your hand wouldn't be able to hold your body weight, so you would just be like, and that you'd fall off the cross. So it's obviously like here, where you have the bone, your wrist bone, and the nail would be in between there, and then the nail, the bone actually holds you together, your bone here, assuming it didn't get ripped off during the whipping, but that's unlikely. After all, the whipping was on your torso. Once again, that's why survival of crucifixion is so low. But anyway, so then once they mount you onto the cross and they put the cross upright, because of course, as you watch in the Jesus movie, when they're putting the nails through you, the guy's lying down on the cross, and then they pull the cross up, and then when Jesus is upright, then becomes, this really terrible, slow, and painful death. And what happens is, basically, the expectation is that you suffocate. So you're hanging on this cross, right? Supported by your wrists and your ankle bones. But what happens is, since you're hanging there, your body would droop, and then as your body droops, your lungs get compressed, and when your lungs are compressed, it's really hard to breathe. So then, because natural human survival instincts kick in, you then would pull on the nails with your busted ass wrist and your feet, and then you would pull yourself up on the cross. And of course, you gotta pull yourself. First of all, your back is already bleeding like crazy from all the whippings you took earlier, and then you have to drag that your bloody back on this block of wood, which once again, this is way more like increased chances of getting HIV and AIDS and stuff like that. So, no way you're surviving. If you somehow survive physical trauma, which you wouldn't, you would die from diseases anyway. So then Jesus would have to pull himself up on the cross, dragging his back against this piece of wood, which, probably some piece of splinters get jabbed into your back. Somehow you don't paralyze yourself as a splinter stabs your spine or something. So he would pull himself up, just so he could breathe. Because once again, people would naturally do that if they were hanging, because your natural survival instincts is like, I gotta breathe. So Jesus would drag himself up, and then you would inflict more pain on yourself just so you could breathe. And then you hold yourself up for a bit, but of course you get a little tired, and then your body starts drooping down again, and then it gets hard to breathe. And then the idea is that you would eventually suffocate from this, because eventually your body would just give up, and then it's like, okay, like, this is it, I'm dead, and then that would be it. Like, eventually your body would just give up. But the contrast of you're gonna die and your natural survival instincts of needing to breathe, this process could go on for hours, and which is kind of crazy to read. If you read like Josephus or Virgil, it's kind of ridiculous to think that like guys actually do this for hours, dragging their bloody bodies on this cross to try and breathe for hours, because somehow your body's still able to do it. Because once again, is that like part of it is adrenaline as well, because your body's like pumping out extra blood, because it's trying to heal your body's your body is actually pretty amazing, and your body's trying to keep itself pumping extra blood to clot and all that stuff, and your body's trying to keep itself preserved, because living is kind of nice, right? So the continual struggle of trying to breathe, and then of course your body would eventually just give out from exhaustion, and then you would suffocate as your body you eventually how you are supposed to die on a crucifix, is that eventually you would just give up, and then you would stop draining your body up, and then you would just like suffocate as your body just hangs there. And so that's basically what happens. And then of course Jesus eventually does suffocate, and he dies. Of course, there's a little bit interesting parts that happens before that happens. So first, he says a few words. He prays, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they do. And he also has a conversation with one of these bandits that's also going through the same process of trying to keep themselves alive from suffocating. And it's funny how one of them decides, you know what, I'm going to spend my last moments just hurling insults, because I guess that's what I've been doing my whole life. And so the guy just hurls insults at Jesus, saying like, oh, like, if you're the Messiah, why don't you save us? And then the other guy's just like, nah, man, like, let's just concede to death, man. Like, this is it. We're gonna die here. Let's just be okay with that. And then he's like, goes to Jesus and just says like, Jesus, remember me. I know there's like these last moments are just terrible, but remember me. And then Jesus says a very interesting line where he says, today you join me in paradise. And of course, there's a lot of theology behind this little exchange, and I'll only cover it briefly. But basically, this idea that even on your, at the very last moment of your life, if you accept Jesus in your life, and I know it's not the like ideal model, you shouldn't just put off believing in Jesus to your dying breath kind of thing. That's not a great way of doing things, but at the same time, the Bible does say it's valid, so who am I to talk, right? But basically, even in this guy's like last moments, and the guy even admits that like, he was a thug and didn't live the greatest life, but in his last breaths, asks Jesus to remember him. Jesus accepts him, and even in your last moments, Jesus can accept you. Even in your last moments, Jesus can accept you, no matter what you've done. And I know the theology behind that is a wonderful thing. I don't want to discourage people, but at the same time, it is kind of like, I know some people use that as an excuse to like, well, I'll just wait till my dying breath and then confess. I'm like, oh, come on, like, oh, really? You're gonna test God like that sometimes? But anyway, I'm not one to. I guess I shouldn't be one to judge, but that is valid because of this story where this thug is remembered by Jesus, and Jesus does say to him, today you will join me in paradise. So in his last moments, he is accepted by Jesus. And then finally we get to this part where Jesus, when he actually dies, he has the last words, and probably at that moment he ran, his breath leaves him because you used your last bit of oxygen to say some words, and then like that's it, suffocation complete. And so Jesus says, I commit into your hands, I commit my spirit, and then he just like collapses and dies. And then it's interesting how like it brings up there's this guy there that's just like some Roman just sees, and he's just like, wow, like this guy was a righteous man. And I know some people think like that's a weird moment, this epiphany that this Roman guard has. And my theory behind it, just from a literary perspective, and you think of this like in like how you live your life kind of thing. This Roman soldier probably has seen a lot of guys die on a cross, and probably most of if not every time before Jesus. What do people say when they're on the cross? They're probably like saying like a plethora of curse words, letting all the curse words out and cursing the Romans and cursing their mothers to eternal damnation. And then here Jesus is just saying like, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do, and Lord, I commit my spirit to you. Jesus is he's very different from the typical, person dying on a cross would behave. And so maybe that was the epiphany that this Roman soldier had. He saw like, wow, like this guy truly he was unique and he was different. And that's what makes him righteous, because, this guy probably was used to like people just cursing at him for, essentially being his killer. And so there's an interesting kind of dynamic there. And I think it's something that, draws us to the person of Jesus and his character. Because that, Jesus, unlike, say, you or me, if it was any of us on that cross, like, you'd be damn sure the last words coming out of my mouth are going to be curse words toward my killer. And that would, that's me and everyone else. You would do that too. But Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus is very forgiving, and he forgives his killer. I mean, metaphorically, because of course, when people ask the question, who killed Jesus, the idea is that like, well, technically Jesus gave his life, but we all, in a sense, we all killed Jesus because of the sin in our life, and Jesus was willing to trade his life for ours. And so in a sense, we all killed Jesus in that sense. It's kind of the theological answer behind it. But despite that, Jesus doesn't look at any of us and just hurl curses like you and I would if you were being murdered. The last thing you would say would be like a curse to your killer. But Jesus doesn't do that. And that is, that's played out in this epiphany that this soldier has. He sees Jesus and goes like, wow, like this was a truly righteous man. Some other minor details. So just to finish off the execution process, because Jesus actually dies before, there's actually a little more to the crucifixion process to ensure you die kind of moment. And this is not mentioned in the book of Luke, because once again, since it didn't happen to Jesus, it wasn't necessary here. But in the book of Matthew account, they check if Jesus is dead. The book of John also brings this up too. They check if Jesus is dead, and the reason why they check is because if he wasn't dead yet, and you would have to go to Josephus and Virgil and other historians, there was something that like when the Romans got tired of waiting, because once again the suffocation process could take hours. When they get tired of waiting, what they would do is they would break the legs of the people on the cross, and we call this the death blow. And so it's in the name. It's a blow designed to bring death. And so what it does is they would break the legs of the person on the cross, and this would ensure that they would no longer be able to pull themselves up so they could breathe. And so if you can no longer drag your body, well then now you're going to suffocate for sure. Assuming that you didn't, suffocate yourself by screaming after having your legs broken. Basically, that would be the last process. But Jesus doesn't go through this, and there's theological reasons why he doesn't. And from a narrative purpose, it fills other parts of Bible prophecy that Jesus doesn't get the death blow. He's dead before that's necessary. For reference, go back to Isaiah 53, and there's this whole since Jesus is equated to a lamb, the perfect lamb in the Passover, you cannot break the bones of the Passover lamb. And so in the same way, Jesus' bones aren't broken. And so the idea is that he was exempt from the death blow. But traditionally, you would receive the death blow and then you would just suffocate well after that, because there would be no way for you to breathe after that. And so I remember in the Mel Gibson Passion movie, they show the death blow. They show the two other guys they're still alive. And so the guys are like, all right, screw this shit. We want to go home now. So they take a huge ass hammer and go like mighty Thor on their legs and just bam, right? And then the guys scream and then they die from that, because that's basically what would happen after the death blow. And I mean, once again, it's in the name, death blow. It's a blow designed to bring death. So the shock would make you scream, and then that would make you exhaust whatever air is left in your body. You would just scream out the rest of your life, quite literally. And so that's what would happen. And the Mel Gibson movie actually shows that pretty well. I mean, that was the whole interesting thing about that movie, is that the Mel Gibson Passion movie really wanted to be super accurate to how the crucifixion process was. And after this whole graphic detailing I've told of it, you have to think of how the pain and suffering there in that process, and to think about how Jesus, an innocent person, went on, suffered that death. And of course, every pastor will tell you this, the idea that, well, Jesus did all that for you and me. That's how much Jesus loves us, that he would go through that, even though he was, he's the one person who doesn't deserve that. But Jesus goes through it anyway because he loves us, and because he would take our place in that position. And even as he does that, he does it so gracefully. He takes death on a cross for us so gracefully that he doesn't curse us. He doesn't, spew cuss words at his killers. He doesn't do that. And, that is tantamount to real love right there. And that is the kind of love Jesus shows to all of us. And that's, the reason why the death part is so important as well. Of course, the resurrection is the core piece of Christianity. You have no resurrection, you got nothing. But the death part is also important to focus on, because it was a reminder of how much God loves us. And I remember there was this one comic, so I can't remember who made it, but someone was pointing out it was a comic between these two people and they're talking. And one guy, the first guy points out to the second guy oh, why do we call it Good Friday? Why do we call the day Jesus died Good Friday, considering how terrible it was that an innocent person like Jesus would die? And then the second guy responds with, well, think of it like this. All of us deserve damnation and separation from God. Yet Jesus went through a very painful death so that we could be free from that. And then the second guy asks the first guy, how does that make you feel? And then the first guy goes, well, I guess it makes me feel pretty good that Jesus would, he would suffer so that I would not. And then the second guy goes, and that's why we call it Good Friday. And so, and it's so true, because when I know for the sake of like not traumatizing people about talking about like how brutal and violent the Romans are and stuff like that. But hey, this is Streaming Parson channel, so hashtag terrible pastor. You're gonna get graphic details from me. But typically we don't do that, and in your typical church service, for sure, we don't talk about how brutal this crucifixion process actually is. But I think when you don't talk about those graphic, messed up elements of the crucifixion story, you do lose a bit of it. You do lose a bit of its meaning, which is why I emphasize on talking about it, because when to put in perspective, like the sacrifice to be willing to do that for someone else, like, and that's the difference between Jesus and the rest of us, because if any of us were honest, we'd all be like, I would never do that for anyone else. And that would, it's that's a rational thing to think. You and I would not do that for someone else. Like hell, I would do any of that. Like hell, I would do that for any of you. And you probably think the same thing. You're like, well, like hell, I would do that for anyone else. And that's rational. There's nothing wrong with thinking that, by the way. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. But on the flip side, I think that's how much more we can appreciate how much Jesus loves us, because he actually does do it for us. And that's the thing that's supposed to like really pull at our heartstrings and remind us that, like, there is a God out there that loves us, that Jesus was willing to go through that death for you and me. And of course, the book of Luke may omit the details, but I think that message comes across pretty well. And of course, any reason of reading the crucifixion story is just to remind ourselves of, like, yeah, Jesus gave his life for us. And, I guess in a sense that makes him the highest bidder. So, if you want to, I know a lot of people think like, oh, why should I believe in Jesus? Well, a good answer is that Jesus is the highest bidder on your life. Think of it like that. And of course, Paul talks about this in the book of Corinthians, for sure. You were bought with a price, a very high price, clearly. Which, when Jesus, think of it like that. Jesus is willing to pay his life for yours. I guess that makes him the highest bidder. And so that's something, to always remember as we read through the Good Friday story. And that's why it's so important for us to, as Easter approaches, and we remember why Jesus went through all that. And it was for love, and a love that none of us can match. Because, we can write thousands of love stories. Thousands of them. And, none of us could ever match up to the kind of love Jesus gives for all of us. Well, I mean, that, some people, and this is where, like, you think of, like, Christian typology comes in. And, of course, you can make some characters do something similar, giving their lives for friends or whatever. And that's what, typology is where you make, like, the parallels between, like, one story to another. But, of course, Jesus is that archetype of that story. And, yeah, we've made many as copycats. But, of course, the reason why we make those copycats is because deep down we know that, like, the love Jesus shows for us by sacrificing his life for ours is the ultimate act of love. And so, of course, like in all our copycat stories, we always tell that story because deep down we know that is as good as it gets. And so to retell the Jesus story in whatever different forms you want to tell it. But at the same time, that's why we tell it, because it's so powerful, and it's to remind us that, like, deep down, ultimately, there is no love greater than the love Jesus shows for us. All right. I'm just gonna skip over this last bit here, where basically Jesus is buried. A guy named Joseph, another Joseph, because there's so many of those too. Um, uh, a guy named Joseph decides to bury Jesus' body in like a high ass fancy tomb. So the thing that the Bible kind of glosses over, but once again, if you understand like historical contexts and just how things are, I mean, we still emulate some of these practices to this day. The kind of tomb that Jesus is given is actually a very high end one, because when it talks about like a tomb cut in a rock. So basically, this guy owned, like, he took like a piece of land, and he's not just putting like a plot in a gravesite, but it's a personal like tomb. The modern equivalency is like basically the guy has his own like mausoleum. That's the word, I think. A mausoleum is just a fancy word for a personal tomb, and it's usually like um, unlike like a grave site, a grave plot, I guess is what we use. A grave plot is like what you get a little rectangle in the ground, and then they put your body 6 feet under. Whereas like a mausoleum is like a personal like structure built. You're not just put into the ground, but you actually have a grave structure built for you. And so Joseph apparently has one of these. That's basically what his tomb cut out of a rock basically is. He has his own mausoleum. But this is quite the move he makes by giving it to Jesus. He puts Jesus in his mausoleum. And so, and the thing that makes it interesting too, of why Jesus gets buried in a mausoleum as opposed to just like thrown into the dirt like most other people, is that because it would have been like a specified, high end tomb, people would know Jesus was buried there. That is one of the important details. I think people forget when we talk about this little detail about Jesus being buried in a mausoleum. Of course, the Catholic Church went like balls to the wall with this, and that's where a whole ass church called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. So if you don't know, well, you should know what this is. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a place. It's a massive ass Catholic church in Jerusalem, and it's supposedly where Jesus was buried. Though, once again, the exact place where Joseph of Arimathea's mausoleum is, it's lost to time, so we don't know exactly where it is, and it really doesn't matter. Um, but basically, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it's a church built over the place where they believe that Jesus was buried, and it's a nice place. It's a very nice place, and this is like funky ass like stone structure deep in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that's believed to be the same rock. But once again, it really doesn't matter if it is or if it isn't. But basically, the idea of Jesus being buried in a mausoleum is that his grave would have been a place that people would have known. He's not just some random plot in the ground. You know, on an unrelated note, and I'm embarrassed to tell this sometimes, but like, I actually don't always remember where like certain family members of mine are buried. So when we go to like the gravesite to put flowers on their graves, I actually have to have like my mom tell me where stuff is, as well as like a fancy ass detailed map that I keep, so that I could look up the map and check where people are buried. Because I don't remember where people in my family are buried, because my family were just a bunch of average ass people with all my family members that we've buried so far. They're just in regular plots at a cemetery. They're not. We don't own a mausoleum. We're not rich people or anything like that. So my family just have, like regular poor people. Our graves are just in regular plots in the ground. But the problem with that, I mean, when cemeteries get as many bodies in there as they do, you don't remember. There are tons of people you don't remember who's who and who's where. But the point of a mausoleum is that no big ass structure. We know exactly who's buried there, and Jesus' body is actually treated this way. That they put him in a mausoleum for this purpose, and this plays out a little. This will play out as we get to the next chapter. But I think it's one of those little important details that people forget. when we talk about like the death of Jesus, that he was actually buried by this guy named Joseph Arimathea, and it's actually significant how he buries him, how Joseph buries Jesus, because it from a storytelling perspective, it it adds a certain kind. Once again, it's the way that the story itself, within the story's internal logic, guards itself from people saying like, well, when people tried to claim Jesus rose from the dead, well, maybe they just checked the wrong plot of ground. You couldn't make that claim because, like, no, people knew where his body would be buried. It was put in a fancy ass mausoleum, so people knew where it was. So if they wanted to, like, when the disciples start claiming Jesus rose from the dead, if they wanted to debunk this, they could go exactly. They would know exactly where to look. That is actually, from a narrative standpoint, the real purpose of telling this part of the story, that Joseph actually is the one who buried Jesus. Because as we get to the book of Acts and people question, if people wanted to question Jesus rose from the dead and say like, oh, we can actually check his grave. But in Joseph's mausoleum actually gives credence to that, because once again, they would know if people wanted to find Jesus' body, they would know exactly where to look. Jesus isn't just like buried in some random plot in a cemetery. All right, that's enough rambling about the death of Jesus, because we get to the final chapter of the book of Luke, and we got the important part of the Christian faith is found in this chapter. So here we go, chapter 24. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices that they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. Now, while they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. Excuse me. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, for he is risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee. The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the 3rd day be raised again." Then the women remembered the words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But the apostles did not believe the women, because their words seemed to them like nonsense. However, Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away wondering to himself what had happened. Verse 13, on the same day, 2 of them, I guess disciples, were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, or 11 kilometers. And they were talking with each other about everything that had happened. And they talked and discussed these things with each other. As they were talking, Jesus himself appeared and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" Their faces stood still, and their faces downcast. And one of them, named Cleopas, asked, "Are you the only person visiting Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened in these last days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one that was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since this all took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us what they had seen, and that they had seen angels, who said he was alive. Some of our companions then went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said. But no one has seen Jesus. The man said to them, "How foolish are you? And how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken? Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he was going further. But the men urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were our hearts not burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" So they got up and returned at once to Jerusalem, where they found the 11 and those with them assembled together, and saying, "It is true! The Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized when he broke the bread. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. Jesus said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I do." When he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And while they still did not believe it because of the joy and amazement, he asked, "Do you have anything here to eat?" So they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. And he said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Then he opened their minds so that they could understand the scriptures. He told them, This is what is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day. And repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning in Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. I am going to send you what my Father has promised. But stay in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high. When Jesus had led them out to the vicinity of Bethany, he lifted up his hands and blessed them. And while he was blessing them, he left them and was taken up into heaven. Then they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. And they stayed continually at the temple, praising God. All right, so chapter 24. Jesus rises from the dead. He is risen. So the story itself, it's funny how the way Luke paints the resurrection story. On the one hand, like the resurrection changes everything. It's why it's like the resurrection is the crux of the Christian faith. You don't got the resurrection, you got nothing. But at the same time, what's funny about reading the Luke account is that the Luke account treats kind of casually, because you would think, with this rising from the dead, and Jesus would do all these crazy things and make it like the biggest deal known to man. I mean, it is, but you would think he would do more to kind of emphasize on how big a deal this is, but he doesn't. And so one thing I always found funny in the book of Luke account is that it has this story where Jesus visits like two other disciples, not of the 11. And the reason why the story brings up that there's only 11 is because Judas has already committed suicide at this point. So to cross-reference, the book of Matthew mentions that Judas commits suicide, but doesn't really tell you much about it. It just says Judas went and hanged himself, and that's it. We learn more about Judas actually killing himself in the book of Acts, which is kind of weird that the Bible would bring that up at a later point in time. But of course, talking about Judas's death brings up something else, like another important thing that we have to deal with later, and that's how like they have to replace Judas with someone else, and then they would be the 12 apostles again, kind of idea. And of course, the number 12 is important because the 12 apostles is supposed to be a parallel to the 12 tribes of Israel. So there's that. But at this point, they haven't appointed their new member yet. And of course, the thing that many people tend to forget is that Jesus had more than just 12 disciples. He had a whole bunch, actually. These two guys going to Emmaus are two of them. So it's kind of funny where, like, in the book of Luke account, the first people Jesus appears to is not even to, like, his 11 like, main guys. But, well, according to the book of John, he actually appears to Mary Magdalene first. But then after Mary Magdalene, if we follow a chronological kind of excerpt, which I know a lot of people don't actually like doing this with the resurrection story, because then you run into other problems. But if you go with the Luke account, after the women have the encounter with the angels, the first people that actually encounter Jesus are like not even the main 11 guys, but two of the other disciples, and neither of them are the guys who were elected to be Judas's replacement, which is kind of interesting. It's just like, once again, it's not as spectacular. Jesus, when he comes back from the dead, he doesn't make this spectacular ass scene about it. He just acts kind of casually, and he just hangs out with two disciples as they're like just going about their business. And I love how, like, when Jesus asks them, like, "Yo, what's up?" and they're like, "Are you for real? Like, are you what, you live under a rock? You don't know what's been happening around here lately?" And then Jesus kind of like plays it off, just like, "Oh, please do tell." And then, the funny thing is that, like, what does Jesus do? He the first thing he does, more or less, after he rises from the dead, is like have a Bible study, which is kind of hilarious, because it's like, once again, he just rose from the dead. You think, like, I think part of it is also like in like Jesus obviously Jesus has been doing this for like the entirety of his ministry, but he subverts the Jewish expectation of the Messiah, if you will. Because, I've talked about this many times where, the Jews had this huge expectation of like the Messiah is going to come in, be like, this grand deliverer and mastery of kicking ass, and then deliver the Israelites from the Roman occupation. And another thing that, like, in Jewish expectation and Jewish thought was that when the resurrection occurs, the resurrection is when people get their, like, magic powers. So, like, who would not be going around using those magic powers after the resurrection? Like, who wouldn't do that? That's the typical expectation. And, to be fair, that's a rational thing to think. what the early Jews thought of how the resurrection would go down. What they think is actually rational. So you can't criticize them too much. But what's more impressive is that Jesus subverts all of that. So instead of doing the typical thing of after the resurrection you do all the cool magic stuff, no, he just has a Bible study with two of his disciples, just hanging out with them. And I think there's a comfort in that too. You want to take it from like on a theological and a pastoral level. One of the things that we can be easily caught up in, like wanting to see miracles from God and want to see Jesus do cool stuff in our life all the time. And who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want that? But I think what's more important is to have the presence of Jesus in our day-to-day life. And so, yes, this is supposed to be like an educational, me doing a Bible study on camera kind of thing. That's what the point of this is. But at the same time, I think, when you just do something like reading through the Word, reading through your Bible, and just knowing Jesus is present with you, that's so much more meaningful than like just the idea of like God doing cool stuff in your life and then nothing else. And I hate to sound so cynical about this, but I think many Christians fall into that pitfall and that dangerous thinking, because some Christians go through life getting their like miracle highs, I guess is the way of wording it. They get their miracle highs, and then what happens when the highs stop? What happened when the miracle highs stop? Unfortunately, you see a lot of people fall from the faith even. Or some people become overly like you think I'm cynical, but like I'm pretty tame in comparison. Where like some people, once the miracle highs come to an end, they become so almost depressed in the faith, and then they make Christianity look like it's such a depressing faith. And then of course other people see that and they're like, well, why would I want to be a Christian? And understandable when people think that, when you run into Christians who live on the miracle high. But I think as we read through the book of Luke, I think the important lesson here is to remember, the more important thing and the beauty of having the resurrected Jesus' presence in our lives. His presence more than like his actions, if that makes sense. It is in his presence that we have peace. It is in his presence that we have, the satisfactions of life. It is in those moments, and not in the miracle highs. As cool as they are. I mean, I'm not downplaying that, like miracle highs, they're awesome. But more importantly, the presence of Jesus in our lives in those more quiet moments, like when Jesus has a Bible study with two disciples on a road. Like, it is those moments that like you have that closeness with him and that closeness with God. And I think that's something that we've lost, I think, a lot in our Christian thinking. And I'd be so bold to say that that's a very dangerous thing, that we've kind of lost that idea. But I think as we read through Luke, I think that's something we need to be reminded of frequently, is that it is not in the spectacular things, And Jesus, I think, as we read through the book of Luke and Jesus subverting a lot of these traditional Jewish expectations, is because if you get caught up in the expectation, you get, how do we say it nowadays? Like if you get too involved in the hype, what happens when the hype is over? But it's about that presence God has imprinted onto your life as you go through your life. That's more important, because that is something of which we will always carry, and knowing that Jesus, the risen Jesus, is in that presence. That is what gives us the power to move forward. That is what gives us the power to live in our empower. And I use that word a lot. I always suggest this idea of like, to be empowered to live. And that's the fundament. That's fundamentally what Christianity is about. Is that like, and I've talked about this quite a bit last week. Talk about the contrast that Christianity has with a lot of other religions, including its predecessor, Judaism. And the idea is that most, if not every other religion, is basically more of and this is understandable why a lot of skeptics, especially more atheist types, they tend to be very antagonistic toward religion. And, there's merit in some of their thinking when it comes to their criticism of religions generally being like death cults. And because most religions are focused on like, well, you have to do good enough in this life so that you don't get totally boned in the next life. That's the TLDR of most religions. And so, that death culty kind of idea is it's not an attractive thing if you actually think about it. And many of your atheist critics are correct in that assessment. They are correct in that. But the point of Christianity and Jesus rising from the dead is the idea that, well, you don't have to live with that mindset, because as the angels told the women, why do you look for the living among the dead? And sure, of course, there is like physical death in this life, but as Jesus lives, the idea is that we can always live. It's always about living. And even though death is physical death is a part of life, and there's a harmony in that too, because of course as Paul would say in the book of Galatians, to die is gain. And that would mean that we would be drawn even closer to Jesus, which I know that sounds kind of death culty, but the idea is that, like, well, physical death is not a big deal, because in Jesus we have life, and not just we have life, but we are empowered to live this life and the next, and whatever life is to come. We are empowered to live. You don't have to focus on, am I good enough in this life? That's not what matters. It is because Jesus lives, and the idea is that as we believe in Jesus, we have a relationship with him, which is where many Christians skip that explanation when they talk about like Christianity is a relationship. Because I hate the statement that Christians make about how like Christianity isn't a religion, it's a relationship. Don't scrap away the religious part to just emphasize the relationship part, because of course that part is obviously important. But of course, there's the religion thing, and to be fair, Christianity is a religion. So you don't I'm not gonna deny, you can't deny that either. But when many Christians, what they actually talk about in that whole relational aspect of Christianity is the idea that as we relate to the living God, and hence the title of Jesus as the living God is so important, is that we have relationship with life itself. And so when you have that relationship with life itself, then you are empowered to live, and you don't have to worry and live in fear of death. And it's one of those things that, like, okay, so here's my, I've had this tirade many a times on this channel already, so sorry I have to like plague you again with it. But I'm a person who hates all that naysaying of like the end is coming soon or whatever. And of course, I know people mean well and talk about like prepare for Jesus to come and all that stuff, and that's obviously true. We should always live, and this is my take: is we live in expectation of Jesus. We live in seeking Jesus and him coming. We live toward that, not, oh, wallow that the world's coming to an end. Ignore them naysayers, all right? Ignore those people, because when Jesus rose from the dead, you know what he was giving? He was giving us the gift of life, that you and I can live, and that we can go through day-to-day life moving forward, pursuing dreams, pursuing God's desires in our life, to build relationship with him and with our neighbor, to live out the laws that God wanted us to live, to be good to each other, to pursue God's lifestyle and live that out amongst ourselves. Jesus rose from the dead so that we could have life to do those things, to move toward those things. And this is one of those things that, like, this is why, like, the streaming Parson exists, is because I really want to hammer that home to you. And that is what Christianity is about. It's about being empowered to live, first and foremost for God, but in doing that, and this is the circular thing I've explained over and over,
is that, well, we do that in our day-to-day life with each other as well, because that's why Jesus rose from the dead and told us, you know, to love one another, because he wants us to manifest the life he has given us, that we don't have to be focused on the death culty, attributes of life and religion. We're not stuck in the death culty mode anymore, but we can live and live for each other as well. That's what Jesus, the strong word I would say is that Jesus demands that from us. And the fact that Jesus rose from the dead and Jesus gives us life, we have no excuse. We should be living and really living, you know. And that's something that I've always, that's something I strongly believe, and that's something that, like, I've always had frustrations with, like, all the naysayers talk about, like, oh, we should prepare for the tribulation. When I was like, those things don't matter, all right? Like, obviously the Bible tells us those things are going to happen, because they are going to happen. They're going to happen. You will have trials and tribulation in your life. And of course, there will be times where there will be people antagonistic to God and toward Jesus, and be antagonistic toward you about it. Jesus told us that himself. Of course, that's all true. But the reason why, the resurrection is the crux of Christianity is that because Jesus lives, he empowers all of us to also live. So you don't get caught in all the naysaying and all the death call, kind of don't be paralyzed by fear. And then, that's the common expression that, like, many people use. Don't be paralyzed by fear. Well, as Christians who, if we have the power of the living God, of Christ in us, then we should be the ones that know how to move forward and to not live in fear, because we have the living God and his presence in our lives. And even in the small things, like, the road to Emmaus, and Jesus just has a Bible study with, like, 2 disciples. Even in quiet moments like that, you have the presence of the living God in you. And that should empower you to live, to move forward in your life. Because that's what Jesus desires from us all. Because then, you read, then, you think of, like, all the other parables and stuff we've talked about on this channel. And you think about all the other, stuff Jesus has said. All those things would not matter. That's true. It would not matter if you were not empowered to live. All those things wouldn't matter. But the resurrection is a reminder to us that because God lives, Jesus lives, you and I can live. And because we can now live, then yes, we can move forward. We can be obedient to God. We can do what he calls us to do, because we have life in the resurrection of Jesus. We have that resurrection. And it is that resurrection power is what empowers us to go forward. That we don't have to be paralyzed by fear and death and darkness. Those things don't have power over you anymore when you have the resurrection of Jesus in your life. As Jesus was revealing himself to, like, the disciples and stuff in the story, and I think that's one of the funny things too, where, like, even the disciples, up to the moment where Jesus, like, come on, guys, like, are you serious? Like, they were still kind of stuck in that death culty thinking, right? Because, I mentioned this in the Jesus Walks on Water story, where one of the major reasons why, in that story, it's kind of funny, the one where Jesus walks on water, in the story is kind of funny, where, like, the disciples all freak out, and rightfully so, is because, they're stuck in that old Jewish thinking. And, well, I mean, it's not just Jewish mythology that believes this. Any mythology believes in this. And the idea was that you never want to see a ghost. And the reason why you never want to see a ghost is because, think of all your horror movies. What usually happens after you see the ghost, right? You're dead. Because the idea, the fundamental idea was that if you were seeing ghosts, the idea was that, let's just say you were 1 foot in the afterlife and your other foot is not far behind. So in the so when the disciples freak out in that story and about like, oh, they thought Jesus was a ghost because they were thinking 1 foot's in the afterlife and the next one's gonna be right behind it, and that's the natural fear. Going back to the whole like that's how people have always thought. But when Jesus appears to them, as we read in chapter 24 here, Jesus appears to them, and it's kind of hilarious. Where like he just does that whole like, I think of like the joke in Team 4-Star's Dragon Ball Abridged when Goku uses his instant translocation ability. He's just like pop and he's there. And I kind of figure that like Jesus just does that. It's just like pop and he's right there. He just appears. And of course, like because Jesus can just do that, right? Once again, that whole post-resurrection magic power thing that the Jews did believe was going to be a thing, and Jesus shows it to them. He just appears before them. And then the disciples are still kind of stuck in that whole like old superstitious way of thinking. And they're like, oh no, like we see a ghost. We're going to join the afterlife soon enough. And then Jesus, he comforts them. He's just like, yo guys, like I'm not a ghost. Like you can touch me like I'm a real person. I'm a real person. Okay, you can touch me like a person. Hell, give me a piece of fish. I'll eat like a normal person. And he does that, and I think that's the reminder of like always pursue life, and that's what Jesus reminds his disciples of in this moment, is to like, oh, you always be in the mindset of life and pursue life. And Jesus' resurrection was, as he reveals himself to them, he was showing them that like, yes, this life is real. And Jesus later extends it to them as a gift. This is the gift I give you, and forgiveness and all that. And that's the crux of Christianity, is that like, yes, we can all have this life. We can all be offered this life that Jesus offers to us. And that, why would you not want that? Why would you not want to, to truly live? Because, for the longest ass time, human beings, we've just been stuck in always thinking about death. But to have life given to us like this, that's as good as it gets. That's as good as it gets. And I think that's something that, we need to always be very gracious and mindful of. And you got to pull at the what's that word I'm thinking of, that it's like not exactly a contrast, but like those two like juxtaposition. Well, juxtaposition is what it is, but like these two, not exactly paradoxical, not paradoxical. Yeah, I can't quite think of the word, but these two contrasting ideas just pulling at each other. We have life, and Jesus offers us life, but now you got no excuse. Go and live it, because John 10:10. He came to give life and life to the fullest. So go live that full life. And I think that's the thing that many people forget about the resurrection. And I think many people lose track of that, I think. And this is where you get a lot of people when one of their criticisms of Christianity is that like, oh, well, if I become a Christian, I can't like party anymore and stuff like that. And, oh, that I have a much more regulated life and whatever. But then if you really like analyze those people's lives carefully, what they mean by not having their own life is that like most people like live very selfishly. But what Jesus taught about is that like we can live and serve one another and be good to one another. And that is to be more fulfilling, right? That we live for the sake of others, and that comes in many different forms. There's no one way of doing that, but the idea is that we can be empowered to live And, people, us humans living in harmony is supposed to be the embodiment of that, of real harmony. And so that is the gift Jesus gives to us. And I think that's something that, as we go through this Easter weekend, I want you guys to really think about that and to really pursue living. Because that is the gift Jesus has given us. And that's the, of course we have to read through the book of Acts, because the book of Luke, the central theme is this kind of shift in the way people thought. And the illustration I use is the change from a death culty normal religious life of Judaism in the Bible's case. But once again, you can literally apply it to anything. But this more death culty way we've always lived versus the new life Jesus gives. And the culmination of this new life is found in the resurrection, and that's kind of how Luke builds the whole thing up. And that's how the book of Luke kind of leaves you on that cliffhanger, because it's like, okay, move from death cult to living your life. Okay, now what? Now, of course, the easy answer is just say, well, that's what the book of Acts is all about. And, that's why we're going to do the book of Acts as our next Bible read, because the book of Acts talks about how people make that change. From the old way of thinking of the death culty expectations of life, if you will, or really living your life in the now and moving to and allowing that to empower you to move to the future and to really live. And so what does that look like? Well, the book of Acts will paint that out for the ordinary people, if you will. Because of course, once again, since Jesus is the Son of God, he's kind of he's not the best example we can use at times, because Jesus is God and, well, you and I aren't. But at the same time, Jesus gave us his gift of life. So how are you supposed to live it? How are you supposed to live that gift? And the book of Acts will paint out a picture for us of how various Christians do that, and the challenges that Christians have doing it. Because of course the book of Acts does paint that it's not an easy thing. But I think as you read through, and I'll talk about this way more as we start the book of Acts. But as we finish through Luke, Jesus tells his disciples, I want you to do something. You're going to do something new. Something new is happening, and you guys will be the instruments of that. And so that will happen as you guys live this new life I have given you. And that's what Jesus basically promises them at the end of chapter 24. And that is something that you and I must always be reminded of as well. Anyway, that's all there's really to say about that. I mean, there's so much more we could say about chapter 24. But I think I've kind of exhausted what I wanted to say. And I think the more important thing is to really hone in on that the overarching theme of Luke, this change from death to life. And with that said, that is something that I want you to consider. And you might be, your natural inclination might be to think, well, like, how are we living in like death now kind of thing? Like, like obviously we're alive right now, but how's the old saying go? Everybody dies, but not everybody truly lives. And as we read through the resurrection story of Jesus, it is the gateway of which we can subvert that idea that, do you get to really live? And that is, that is the $1,000,000 question now, isn't it? Is, do you, or are you ready, or more accurately, I guess I should ask, are you ready to really live? Because that's the gift that Jesus offers us in his resurrection, is the gift of truly living. Because when you bring the death and resurrection stories together, the idea, the fundamental idea of Easter is that Jesus embraced death so that we can truly live and not ever worry about that, because Jesus has conquered death in that as well. In his resurrection, he has conquered death, and so since death is in a way no longer a factor, what's stopping you from living? But I guess, you have to accept that gift, and that's the gospel message. As belief in Jesus is the acceptance of that gift, that we can not exact. I don't want to say like be exempt from death. That's not what I'm getting at. But the idea that like death is no longer a problem, but just be focused on living because Jesus has given us life. And so those are my closing words. That's it for Good Friday and Easter. You can kind of double this as a Good Friday and Easter kind of Bible read. And I swear I didn't plan this, but it's funny that we get to the end of Luke on the Easter weekend, and just kind of give all the Easter sermon bits as well. But with that said, we're done the book of Luke. Not next week, but the week after. So next week is the 22nd, I think. So the 22nd, we're gonna take a short break. We will not be doing a Bible reading stream next Friday. We'll take a break, and then on the 29th, we will begin the book of Acts. I was considering taking 2 weeks off, but I think I think it's fine. I only need the 1 week. So starting the 29th of April, we'll start reading the book of Acts. So not next week, but the week after. Just kind of keep that in your minds. 22nd, there will be no stream. We'll take a break from our Bible study for a little bit there. And then the 29th, we will begin the book of Acts. So that's how our Bible reads, just a little update on that, because we are finished Luke and we will start Acts, but we won't start Acts next week. We'll start the week after. On top of this, let's just go over, some housekeeping and for streams next week. From the looks of it, we might not stream that much next week, because hopefully on Monday, which yes will be Easter Monday, which I know would be kind of weird to like do a finale of Triangle Strategy, at least the current playthrough I'm in. We are in the final chapter, which I was taken aback by. I was like, final chapter. I was like, on Monday we'll try and finish Triangle Strategy, and then if that is the case, we finish it on Monday. We'll take Wednesday off as well. And so next week we'll only stream Monday, and I should be able to beat Triangle Strategies by then. What we will do after is a huge question mark as far as games are concerned. We will probably go back to, we might do a podcast or something on a Wednesday or something if I end up streaming more next week, because I haven't done a podcast in a while. So with that said, that's how next week's looking. So the TLDR is Monday has Triangle Strategy. Not sure about the rest of the week, because Wednesday is a question mark, and Friday there will be no stream next week. And so it'll be pretty relaxed next week, and I think I need a little bit of a break myself. So I think that's a good way of going about it. But I'm also close to finishing Triangle Strategy, so that's going to be something fun to watch, I'm sure. Watch me suffer. I know you find that entertaining. But anyway, that's that's it for housekeeping, which means this is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys enjoyed reading through the book of Luke. I hope you guys really learned something, and I hope I've inspired you in our Luke study. I find the book of Luke to be one of the books I read the most, and of course that's mainly because the book of Acts is actually my favorite book in the Bible. No, it's a weird statement to make, but I know everybody would be like, "What? It's not a gospel?" But the book of Acts is my favorite book to read because, of course, it's all, it answers that question that I posed to you. Not, like 5 minutes ago. What does it mean to truly live? And so, look forward to the 29th of April when we begin the book of Acts. I'll obviously tell you more about that. Like, it'll be the same like as we always have, but I'll obviously remind you closer to the date. I mean, it is like 2 weeks from now, so there's that. But anyway, with that said, this is going to be the end of the stream. I hope you guys enjoyed reading through the book of Luke with me. And I will see you guys on Monday for Triangle Strategy, the finale of that series as well. So have a great Friday. Have a great weekend. Have a wonderful Easter. And God bless you.